Everyone, so tonight, our guest is Kevin Nye. He is an author, speaker, and the co-founder of the National Faith Coalition to End Homelessness. His books, Grace Can Lead Us Home and Hope for the Mission, help Christians and faith communities confront the crisis of homelessness with care, faithfulness, and best practices. He lives in Minneapolis with his wife and two sons. And for just full disclosure, I was on the launch team for both books. So that meant I got an early look at them, but I also bought the books. And they're really good, both of them. So I kind of recommend you look up Grace Can Lead Us Home and Hope for the Mission, which is Hope for the Mission is the newest one. So look for them both. Very good books. And tonight we're going to be discussing a little bit about some of the concepts in his book, Hope for the Mission. And he's gotten these questions just like everybody else in advance as well. But to start off, I just wanted to kind of ask you to give us kind of a synopsis of especially Hope for the Mission and what your mission, so to speak, is for right now, especially with the unhoused and how we can, as faith communities, address that.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Yeah, so Hope for the Mission came about. I wrote Grace Can Lead Us Home, and that book is really focused on how we sort of see the issue of homelessness, how we think about it, how we understand it. It was very, very head and heart. Um, and a lot of times when I was having conversations like this with folks about that book, the question that kept coming up was like, okay, so what do we do? Right? Like now I've now understand the issue better. It hits me in my heart. I know we need to do something. Now what? And so that was sort of the impetus for going into Hope for the Mission is to kind of take that head and the heart and turn it into hands and feet. Um, but in doing that, I felt like I kept running into the the sort of prevailing model that Christians have used historically to address homelessness and my concerns about that model. And so ultimately, then I felt like I had to write this book that felt like it was being critical of a particular way of doing things, but I didn't want to write a whole book about what I think is wrong, right, or what I think is going wrong. And so what I ended up writing is a book that has a couple chapters at the beginning that talks about a model that I have concerns with, but then spends the rest of the book telling stories about churches and people of faith and communities of faith that are doing really amazing things and getting to celebrate what they're doing, talk about why it's amazing, talk about put different organizations that are doing different work across the country and sort of draw out what are the things that they have in common, what are the stories within these stories that are interesting. Also that people and churches can walk away from this book feeling one inspired that the church is doing really amazing things on the at the forefront of the fight to end homelessness, but also to um, consider what all different types of churches and individuals could themselves do. Sort of present a huge menu of options to look at and draw from.
Good. So, the first couple of chapters, you are very critical of
Yeah.
the mission, uh, capital M mission,
Yeah.
of the way that homelessness missions have been done. And we actually looked at some church history last week.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking, especially this one of these first questions is you kind of trace the rescue mission model back to Jerry McCauley,
Mhm.
and he had an original vision, and it kind of got diluted. So um, could you describe kind of that history and how we might be able to recover his vision rather than just update language or just change, the language around how rescue missions work or what we're even doing with homelessness?
Sure. Yeah, what was really interesting about studying that, and this is the first time that I felt like I did historical research for anything that I've written, right? Like I've done a lot of reading and research, but to really like read primary texts, like I read Jerry McCauley's autobiography. I read his successor's autobiography. All these different really historical documents, and it's just that period of time is such a fascinating one. I think it is even outside of the study of poverty or rescue missions, the Gilded Age, right? We can learn a lot about right now by studying that time period. But one of the really fascinating things for me is seeing that sort of um, perfect storm of political, theological, um, and sociological realities and ideas that were all swirling around. That right in the middle of that, this guy Jerry McCauley, who grew up poor, falsely imprisoned for a decade, um, came out of prison, found Jesus, and wanted to serve people who were like him, right? And to give them not just a place to have a meal, but also a place to have an encounter with spirituality. Because at that time, um, the churches, even the ones that were in the downtown areas, were not too receptive of folks like him. And so, in many ways, what he was offering was something that he felt he needed, right? Which was a place where he could eat a bowl of soup, get a piece of bread for the day, and also have an encounter with God and have an encounter with other folks who wanted to have an encounter with God. Um, and what that has become over time is something very different than that, where the the mixture of basic needs with spirituality has become very transactional. It's become very coercive, right? Um, and I actually, when I was reading Jerry McCauley's stuff, I went into it thinking like, oh yeah, like the roots of all that are gonna be in here. Like it's was that way from the beginning, and I just kept seeing a guy who was trying to help people like him in the way that he was helped, right? And and so you asked, how do we kind of get back to that? Um, I think one of the things that made it so distinct, and I and I never want to like gloss over history, right? And say like, oh, his was the perfect version, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
sure there were flaws. I'm sure if I went, I would have issues, right? But I think again, what was special was that it wasn't run by like a retired evangelical pastor who grew up in the suburbs, right? It was run by somebody who came from that community, who knew what it was like to grow up in poverty on that street, right? And who knew what it was like to encounter religion in a way that still met him in his poverty and offered him something. And he knew what it was like to be scorned by religious people who were wealthy and treated him like dirt, right? Those were all experiences that he had that he was able to then navigate this sort of murky water of offering spirituality and basic needs together. And that's not to say that anyone running a mission has to have had those experiences themselves, but to understand the complexities of that and to understand the dangers of holding basic needs hostage or ransom because you're trying to manipulate somebody into accepting a religious experience or tenet or precept.
Yeah. No, that's good stuff. And like I mentioned, you are kind of hard on rescue missions at the beginning, but as someone who worked in food insecurity several years ago, we had issues with the way that missions ran as well. In fact, we couldn't serve the Nashville one at the time because of some of their rules and the transactional nature of it.
Wow.
But you also reserve a lot of space for hope within this, and you particularly mentioned the city rescue mission in Oklahoma City. And what kind of conditions there exist there where you mentioned Aaron Gooden, that there was a transformation possible? Why was it different at Sea Rescue Mission Oklahoma City?
Yeah, it's a great question. And since the book's come out, I've learned of more. So I don't want to just say that it's like there's only one good one. Um, but I think what was special about that story is they went from being one of, I think, the worst examples of a rescue mission to one of the best examples in a short period of time, right? That transformation was stark. And I think part of the recipe for that was a change in leadership. Um, I think that over and over in every story about either a good or a bad or somewhere in between, it came down to the leadership and what they were willing to do and how leadership changes over. I think what was unique about the Oklahoma City rescue mission is that the city donors, the kind of surrounding community, the news was all kind of fed up with the mission and how they were operating. Um, and so when the leadership changed, there was sort of a community already behind there being a change. Versus there's a story I tell in the book of one that's in the Knoxville area that had a leader who came in and changed a bunch of stuff and just was met with resistance, resistance, resistance. And then when he left, they swung completely back in the other direction, right? So that I don't know how to manufacture that necessarily, or if it is just a perfect storm of things, but the community has to be ready. Um, and the change has to not just come from within, but from external, the desire and the need and the want for something different.
Yeah. Um, and you do engage this both theologically and practically. And I would kind of say that we don't really separate those if we consider that. But you mentioned a bit that there have been some harmful practices within missions,
Yeah.
and you even write that intention is irrelevant because we can have good intentions but do things poorly. And I think some of you have probably heard that from Pastor Terry in Sunday school, and from other places as well, where sometimes we may have good intentions, but if it's harmful, it's harmful. But how can we, especially as Christians, pastorally or even kindly engage those who have been well-meaning, have given years to this kind of work, who would hear critique as a dismissal of that sacrificial giving?
Yeah. Yeah, I had to message you, Brandon, and just say I love these questions so much. They were so thoughtful. Um, I think there's a number of things that I would say. I think one of them is that just because we critique systems doesn't mean that any and all participation in that system is negative, right? I think that folks can volunteer at a mission, even if the mission has some harmful practices, and have a real meaningful encounter with a person who experiences homelessness. They can offer conversation, they can offer hope. I also believe that rescue missions that have harmful practices have kept people alive, right? By offering them a safe place to sleep, offering food, where there might not have been other opportunities for food, right? So it's not a everything involved is bad kind of situation. I know so many people who have worked at rescue missions and had really meaningful experiences, even though they disagreed with a lot of stuff. And then they went on to work in a different organization that better aligned with their values. But, they speak of their time at the mission as still really meaningful, right? Um, and so I think I also would sort of liken it to, um, if you've ever shopped at a store and then you found out that the owner of that store was a bad person, right? That might change how you interact with that store going forward, but it doesn't mean that you were a horrible person for shopping at that store up until that point, right? There's a know better, do better involved, but it doesn't invalidate everything that's come before. Um, and again, I think that in the book, I cite examples of really, really harmful missions. But I'd say the vast majority of missions are somewhere in the middle of doing really important, meaningful stuff and having some harmful practices baked in. And some of them are in the midst of doing the work to remove some of that. They've taken away some of it and need to take away more. It's a spectrum, and folks are on different levels of that journey.
Yeah, that's good that we can. I think a lot of times, especially when we prophetically speak or we speak into systems, um, people we will take, even especially if we are part of the system,
Yeah.
we'll feel that that critique is coming at us. But I think if we're able to separate the two, it can help us.
Hmm.
Um, and speaking of separation, you you talk a bit about homelessness being both physical and spiritual. You draw on
Hmm.
the Gospel of John here, specifically chapter 14. And we actually, before our series, went through a series with Pastor Hunter on resurrection. And he talked about how there's not really this separation between the physical and spiritual. So this really resonates, I think, with our church here, especially. But what does it mean if we see it as both physical and spiritual practically for how a church should structure response? Does spiritual care have a place? And if so, how do you do it without sliding back into coercion,
Yeah.
especially?
Yeah. Again, all great questions. I think that, yeah, that it can be helpful for conversations to separate between physical and spiritual, but I think that it is largely just a language thing that we're doing, right? Like feeding somebody a meal and it's the first meal that they've had in 3 days is both a physical and spiritual experience, right? Like we cannot separate those. Um, because even in the providing of the meal, the way that you provide it, what you say, how you serve it, whether you sit with them, all speaks to things like you deserve to eat, right? Or you deserve to not starve. You belong here. I I am willing to sit with you, therefore we are neighbors, we are kin, we are equals, right? These are all spiritual notions that are all communicated through the serving of food in that moment. And food is a biological need to survive, right? So these things are all tied together, whether we name them or not. But I think there is power in naming them and leaning into it, right? Even if subliminally serving someone food says you deserve to eat, I think it can be really powerful when a church says, you deserve to eat every day, and you deserve to eat good food, and you deserve to eat among people. And the reason I believe that you deserve that is because I believe that you're made in the image of God, just like me, right? I think that's a very, very powerful statement that the church has an opportunity to make um, in how it serves that often, so my day job, I work at a non-religious nonprofit, right? And I do still see a lot of my work as very spiritual, and helping people understand that they belong, that they're cared for, that they have purpose, that their life has meaning. Um, I don't, I don't often connect that to my Christian faith, even though that's where it comes from for me, right? But I do think there is something powerful for a church to be able to do that and to do that in the name of God, in the name of Jesus. Where it can become coercive is when really any choice is stripped from people, right? So when you say, you know, we're going to serve this meal, but before we serve the meal, we just wanted to share a quick sermon with you, right? Or let's all stand and sing before the meal, um, or uh, even there being sort of the implication of special treatment for folks who participate in religious stuff, right? Um, I was talking to somebody who works at a rescue mission recently, and we were kind of having a friendly conversation about some of these practices, and he said, we got rid of, we don't have the sermon before the meals, like you don't have to do anything, but also our staff are always prepared to share the gospel with somebody. Um, and the conversation was interesting because I sort of argue that even in that setting where you haven't made participation uh, required, there is sort of an interesting power dynamic, right? Where staff are consistently trying to convert people. And the message that that sends to folks is, oh, staff might like me better or treat me better if I engage with this. Like I might get that extra scoop of food, or I might get to stay an extra night. And I bring this up in the book as a historical thing that folks who lived on the streets and engaged with these missions would create these like slang terms for how they had to manipulate um, the systems. Like they were called cold weather Christians, where um, as the weather started to turn every year, folks would convert to Christianity so that they would have a bed for the whole winter. Or the phrase "singing for your supper" um, was this notion that if you sang loud and proud, then you would get served an extra helping, right? I think there's very subtle ways that we do that. And we just have to be so careful and recognizing that as folks in that situation with power and with the access to a resource that they need, coercion can happen really easily.
Um, and you mentioned in both your books your Nazarene and Wesleyan background.
Yeah.
And so, how does Wesleyan holiness theology specifically inform your view that homelessness is systemic rather than individual spiritual failure?
Yeah. I've never been asked this question, so I love this one. Um, yeah, so I consider myself very, very Wesleyan in my theology, even though my kind of official affiliation with the Church of the Nazarene is no more. Um, I I would say one, I love the Wesleyan approach that seeks truth wherever it can be found, right? That I can hold scripture as an authority. I can also hold data as an authority. I can hold experience as an authority, all to inform my faith and believe that God is involved in all of those things. Um, because it has been my experience, it has been listening to the experience of people who are unhoused. It's been my time spent reading, studying, understanding the data that informs my belief that homelessness is systemic more than individual, right? I'd also say that um, Wesley, more than most theologians, views everything through the lens of love. Um, and that deeply informs how I approached this work from my first days doing homelessness work. And if love means like actually caring for the person, it it undoes any paternalism, right? It doesn't allow me to put myself in this higher echelon of person that is graciously serving these lower folks, right? Um, Good, actual, uh, godlike love is incarnational. It's uh, giving up power. It is um, fully equitable relationship. And it's in those relationships that I've come to the conclusions that I have, which match the data and match all these other things.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball, but not a bad one.
Okay.
You tell a lot of stories about
Mhm.
what is working, and so could you give us a story about somewhere that's making a difference um, in terms of in terms of homelessness, who's having a good impact in their community?
Yeah. I mean, the the second book is full of them. Um, I'm I'm having to choose, and that's hard.
Yeah.
But there's so many stories, and there's so many like uh types of stories too, right? There's churches that have sold their entire property because the church was dying. There were like three or four members left, and their legacy, instead of just selling the property to the highest bidder and making the most money, is that real estate is now deeply affordable housing for folks who absolutely need somewhere to live that is affordable, right? Then there's also churches that just are faithfully stewarding a food pantry for 30 years, right? There's churches that have served a weekly meal for years and like built more and more resources around that. Um, Churches that had nothing else to give except they said, you know what? We don't use our parking lot overnight. Let's let the city and the service provider have access to our parking lot and our bathrooms so that people who sleep in their cars can have a safe place to sleep and not feel like their car is going to get towed or that broken into. And we're able to then meaningfully keep their employment and end their homelessness, right? All because a church just said yes to using their parking lot. There's so many examples like that. Um, oh, I have a cool one that's not in the book, if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so there was a group of churches in San Diego who said we want to do something about homelessness, and they did a really meaningful thing, which was they kind of surveyed what already existed around them so that they didn't duplicate. They talked to a bunch of unhoused folks and said, what's missing? Like, of all the services that are out there, like, what do you wish there was that wasn't? And folks kept saying storage. Like, we have nowhere to safely store our belongings so that we can move around, so that we can go to appointments without having to drag all of our possessions around the city, right? And so these few churches got together, worked with the city to get one level of a parking structure, fenced it off, got basically those Costco storage bins, gave everybody two bins, and they staffed it for 4 hours a day. So 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, folks could either drop off or pick up their belongings. Um, and then the city did a smart thing and they put an employee there whose job it was to sign people up for housing. And in just a few years, over 100 people managed to secure housing through just this storage program. And all that it took for the churches was just volunteers, a couple hours a day, shared among multiple churches, and it had this huge impact. Because when you have storage, you have a place to keep your ID, your social security, all of these things that you need when it comes time to apply for housing. And so that to me is just a great example of a few churches saying yes and taking the right steps of asking what is actually needed, not what do we think you need, but what do you say you need, and it being successful.
Hmm. It's good. So you also talk about when organizations and churches uh, try to do stuff but face the little acronym is NIMBY, but not in my backyard. So
Yeah.
um, there's often opposition to things. But you mentioned Beacon Interfaith and Firm Foundation, who both faced that, but they won. And so what advice would you give a church, somebody listening here, especially that wants to build housing but is afraid of the community backlash?
Yeah. I would say start early in terms of your outreach. Um, because I think it never feels good to be blindsided, and you're never going to like trick the community for the entire time that it takes to construct something. So you
Yeah.
might as well let the cat out of the bag earlier. Hold community meetings, hold educational opportunities. Um, be prepared to point to examples that already exist. Like if there's something similar to what you want to do already somewhere in the city or a nearby city, like be prepared to bring those people to tell their story. If there's a neighbor who was skeptical over there and changed their mind, that's a perfect spokesperson, right? Um, and then really it's just about showing up and outnumbering the naysayers, right? There are folks who are never going to be convinced, um, and who are going to rally all of their friends and family and put horrible slogans onto signs, and you just have to be louder and kinder, but louder than those folks, if you want to kind of turn that tide. Um, and also sometimes the community is just not ready. And I think that there is a long game to it. There is a, you know, the community won't embrace this. What can we do to start changing minds? And that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like hosting educational stuff at a congregation. It can look like volunteer opportunities so that folks have an experience with unhoused people so that it's not a scary what if in their brain, it's an actual memory. Um, like those are all things that you could do, and sometimes you still lose. Um, and that's just the reality of it. But it's still worth doing and worth trying.
Yeah. Um, Another thing you do in the section on hope is you mentioned a couple of organizations that actually center people with lived experience and leadership. So one is Street Voices of Change, and then one that I think a few people in the room probably have some knowledge of is Open Table Nashville.
Yeah.
But you even made a point of compensating people you interviewed. So what would it look like to genuinely share power rather than simply be a consultant or just simply consult?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy to do. It's something that as I've been kind of building out the National Faith Coalition to End Homelessness, I recognize like how intentional you have to be, right from the beginning. Um, I think it's so easy to speak for and over people, even again with the best intentions, and even out of a very like strong knowledge base, right? Like I am not someone who's ever experienced homelessness. This has been every waking moment and breath is studying, writing about, working with people experiencing homelessness, and I still have to remind myself that I don't know what it's like to sleep in a tent under a bridge overnight. And that's just an aspect of expertise that has to be in the room that I can never bring, right? Um, and that it has to look more than tokenism, right? Like, okay, I checked that box because I got one person who experienced homelessness to agree with me, right? Because that's often what lived experience means is we got we got one of the good ones or one of the nice ones or one of the ones that already agrees with us to say, I was homeless and I think you're right. Um, because that's, I mean, we know what we're doing when we do that, and it's not the point. The point is centering that experience and being willing to say, I might be wrong about this because the person who's right is the person who actually knows what's up.
Yeah, it's good. Now, kind of expanding out now, and we're going to get into some policy stuff.
Oh
But
God,
yeah,
policy.
you're, this book was being written and came out at a time when both homelessness numbers are at record highs.
Yep.
Supreme Court ruled in favor of criminalization in Johnson versus Grants Pass.
Yeah.
And there's the Cicero Institute has been pushing anti-capping legislation nationally,
Hmm.
which, if no one's familiar, the state of Tennessee was one of the very first states
Yeah.
to essentially criminalize homelessness. Now they couch it in other language of saying you can't camp on public land and other things, but we've seen someone actually receive a felony for being homeless, and so these are real things that are impacting. So how can we maintain hope when those kind of winds seem to be blowing the other direction, like trying to to impede help for people out of whatever reason.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that give me hope, right? One is that winds change. They've changed recently in the direction that they have, but that also means they can change back in the other direction. Um, I think that it is really meaningful and hope-giving to me that so many people are talking about this issue who were not 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, if you look at any local election pretty much across the country, if you're not talking about housing, you're not getting elected, right? Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has equally good plans about housing, um, but folks have opinions, and folks are having to form agendas and platforms around affordable housing, which was not true 10 years ago. In the last presidential election, housing was talked about like so much amongst the candidates, and I'd never seen that in a presidential election in my lifetime. Um, and so to me, the fact that this issue is on everyone's minds means that nothing of what can happen will happen in the dark, right? That at least, um, when the Supreme Court made that decision, um, it was national news. Obviously, some people like me who was following it really closely, and others who learned about it later, right? Different levels of involvement, but um, it's you cannot live in or near a big city and not have at least one conversation during the week about homelessness, right? Um, and that to me means that conversations are being had, that folks are being turned to, that you all thought to invite me to come talk to you tonight, right? Those things are happening and I see it. Um, and that gives me a lot of hope that it's not a short game, it's a long game. But this has to be leading somewhere.
And in Hope for the Mission, you kind of end on this call to turn I into we. Um,
Yeah.
and so, kind of, what's the one thing you say, especially to a reader who finishes the book and feels a little overwhelmed rather than
Mhm.
inspired?
Sure.
Because I know when you're hit with a lot of statistics, a lot of data that process, and then there are some unhopeful things. But then you give us hope. But what is that thing you'd say to a reader who finishes feeling a bit overwhelmed?
Yeah. Well, I think the stats and the numbers and all of that, um, it can feel overwhelming, but it also, I think most of us know that homelessness is a really big problem that's getting worse, right? So the looking at those numbers and presenting that data, um, isn't meant to overwhelm. It's meant to validate your experience and to hopefully help you like categorize that experience and make sense of that experience. And I think again, the more you know, the more you can do, the more you can act, and you can act out of knowing rather than reacting out of stress or despair. Um, to me, the book was meant not to be a list of here's all the things that a church has to do in order to confront homelessness. It's a menu of here's all of the different ways that churches of different sizes and makeups can do something meaningful about homelessness. But the notion of taking an I and turning it into a we, because I know that reading is typically an individual experience, right? I just wanted people who were reading to know that the most important thing you can do after you're reading and feeling like you need to do something is to find someone else who agrees with you, whether they've read the book or not, but who's also says, I want to do something about this. and just keep expanding that outwards. And often that can become a group of people who start a new thing, or it can be a few people who find another group who's already been doing something who needs more support, right? Um,
Yes.
and then becomes um, a much bigger agent of change than just a bunch of individual people going, I don't know what to do. Uh,
Yeah.
I can't remember where it was, but it was like a very old political cartoon of like a person saying like, I wish there was more I could do. And then the cartoon zooms out to show like a planet full of like thousands of people all saying like, I wish there was something I could do. Uh, and so that's kind of what I had in mind when I was writing that.
Yeah, that's good. And I think a lot of the hopeful stuff you put in the book gives us an idea that, you know, one church isn't going to change everything, but there is something you might be able to focus on, like you mentioned in San Diego, where churches got together, just something as simple as storage. We may not even think of those kind of things. So it's like, sometimes I think we could feel overwhelmed as churches as to, we can't solve this. Well, we
Hmm.
can if we're just thinking in terms of that way, but we can address things in where we have the ability. So, and then when we get with others, we can do even more. And I know we've partnered with other churches for some of the things we do with feeding programs. So
Yeah.
uh, that's been really good. Like when we partner with community church and take the summer meals out. So um, I think it's important for us to do that. Now, um, one of the things you talk about in the book is you talk about the organization City Gate, which is an organization that's kind of what rescue missions belong to. It's not like the Red Cross where it is the uh, main organization, right? It's more like a confederation. So kind of like food banking is the same way. You'll see ads for Feeding America, same kind of thing. There's this overarching organization that helps with lobbying and other things, but you were actually prevented from attending one of the meetings when you were doing
Yeah.
a social. Has that changed at all um, since that happened?
Yes and no. I mean, yeah, the long story short is I wanted to go to their summer conference and it happened to be in the city where my parents live, so it would have been really easy to attend. Um, and they saw who I was. They had seen that I wrote an article a few years back criticizing them, and they said, "No thanks. You can't come to our thing." But I did have a conversation with the CEO of Citygate a few weeks later. And and I also got access to the recordings of all of the sessions at the conference. So I kind of tricked him and got to go in a way anyway. Um, and both in my conversation and in listening to the recordings, there was a lot that I was surprised by and encouraged by, and some stuff that I was discouraged with, and that I thought, yeah, that's kind of what I expected. Um, and then some other experiences that I can't really share publicly, but suggest to me that they are exploring more and more um, the housing first and the kind of what I argue are the best practices that haven't necessarily been their way, that they've been more open to kind of engaging them and hearing from experts outside of myself. And I've sort of recused myself from those conversations because I think I'm the guy that they don't like, who said the things that they didn't like, and I can just sit in that and allow other people to, you know, speak to them in a way that they're able to hear. But I don't know. The jury's still out. I think it's going to be a long time before Citygate as an organization says we have reversed our stance, our historical stance on a lot of these things. I think where they're actually at now is saying missions. that belong to us have all sorts of different approaches to this, and we think that's fine. Which is better than what it used to be, which is if you are a mission, these are the things that you do, and those were the harmful practices, right? They've loosened all of that. Um, I would wish that they would take stronger stances on what works, rather than sort of playing it safe, but you take the wins where you can.
Yeah, and you do give some in amongst all the day that shows some discouraging things. You do mention some things where because of other ideas like Housing First, where veteran homelessness was has been
Yeah.
down about 55% since 2010 because of that shift to getting someone in a house before you deal with any of the other things that they might be facing.
Yeah, and that's what's been really kind of, I guess, frustrating about the latest turn of events where Housing First has been framed as this, radical liberal agenda. When Housing First was applied to veteran homelessness, it was under the Bush administration, and every administration of every party, whatever they changed in every other area, they all stuck with the housing first approach. It's a bipartisan success story of nearly ending veteran homelessness in a 25-year period using this methodology, right? And unfortunately now it's been reframed as something else and being done away with. It's a shame.
Yeah.
But again, winds change
Yeah.
and
So
they can change.
um yeah, a reminder sometimes that we get caught up in things that aren't as important instead of helping people. So
Yeah.
does anybody have any questions? Make sure y'all before I ask other little things here. Uh, want to give everybody a piece of if they had any questions here. Um,
You know, let everyone have a piece of me.
yeah, I mean, if, I don't think they're going to be asking a lot of questions. Everybody looks like they've uh, have gotten them answered, or like I said, this is always a lot, but um, you do give a lot of hopeful stuff, and I'm going to mention just some of them. You mentioned how Minneapolis, the Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative has like 70 plus churches have been able to help with a housing developer in Minnesota to help with homeless. Um, you mentioned people in California like Firm Foundation that we mentioned earlier. There's Lazarus in Atlanta, and that's just a different way of doing things. I really encourage y'all to read this book. There's some great stories about some of these things. Like I said, Open Table Nashville, that's been here in the Nashville area for a long time. But there's some people coming out with unhoused led advocacy and shelter bills of rights that I think are helpful. Um, and you give just some amazing things with micro shelters, and you talked about the having a church with a parking lot where people that are living in their cars are just able to go, and they're not facing being kicked out. They can use some restrooms, sometimes showers, and it's safe. They're not going to be towed, and there's usually some kind of security that goes through occasionally. And we all know that a lot of times this parking lot sits empty, and not that we would probably have a whole lot that would come here, but I think any church that has a parking lot, we go through their churches in downtown Nashville that charge for parking, during the week because it's valuable real estate. But you can think of what they could do at night, different ways to do things. So um, you kind of give a lot of multi-pronged ways to help, and I think that helps us with the I we part where um, I felt really encouraged because, you know, we have a food pantry. It's not huge, but we serve people, and the way that we serve people has never changed. It's always been one where of cooperative and treating people as human beings, and I think that's why we're trusted. You all have no clue sometimes the things that we get told from people and other nonprofits about what they think of our food pantry. Our little food pantry is thought of very highly because we take some of these ideas of the person um, being valuable, and that we're not over anybody. We're partners with them and we share with them. And that's why we hear stories from them about their lives and things that they need, that they never feel pressured to come here. You'll always have the couple that'll say, "Hey, I'm going to be at church." We're like, "Well, that's not at all necessary. We would love to see you, but that's not why we do this. We do this to give you food, and we don't care where you go to church." So I think just the way that we do those things, and I think um, I would say that one of the things that came out of reading Hope for the Mission, especially, is there's this hope for the missions, like that the rescue missions can change. And I've been in ministry off and on for 40 something years, and I've been to different missions, and I've seen some of the practices that are both harmful and helpful, the different things that go on. But there's also the hope in the mission that there is hope to end homelessness as we look at this and how we can do things, and it's not a hopeless thing that we engage in, which is why I love your title, Hope for the Mission. So
Appreciate it.
any questions?
I do have one question. Um, I'm a little off camera here, but
Yeah, sorry, I can't see you at all. I'm imagining what you might look like.
I've sent you a friend's request on Facebook, so you
Okay.
will. I am, but B, as someone who has a deep interest in investment in the unhoused and serving them, I have often wondered, is it maybe more beneficial to have separate homes where they truly feel like they belong in a place that's theirs rather than maybe just one large facility and start with, maybe smaller places and allow them to get the sense of, sometimes there's a lot of trauma. Typically, there's a lot of trauma involved or mental health things going on, and you get around 100, 150 people, it starts to be a lot on them mentally. And so I wondered if you know of any of the missions that are kind of taking maybe a smaller approach and like building up homes to make people more comfortable and really discipling them like that.
Yeah. Thank you for asking, Aaron Weeks.
Yeah.
Friend request granted. Um, it's a great question. I think that one of the things that rescue missions struggle with that kind of isn't their fault is that most of them were built to be shelters, like overnight shelters, which means they are large facilities with large rooms that are meant for people to have a place to sleep overnight, but not really a place to like make home, right? A lot of these are just big rooms with bunk beds or cots or things like that. And that's a facilities issue that they inherited, right? It's very hard to transition your model if you can't transition the building itself, right? Um,
Right.
I think that if missions were to sort of start from scratch, and a lot of them who are maybe doing a remodel or opening a bigger property are looking more at how do we have more private space? How do we, instead of having one big room with a bunch of people where nobody gets any sleep, but everyone feels afraid and everyone's freaking out and waking each other up all the time. Um, how do we have a better, more dignified approach to shelter? But then I think you're also bringing up the conversation of investing in shelter versus investing in permanent housing, right? That people who are staying in shelter are still homeless, right? They just have a place to go at night, but it's not a permanent fix. The permanent fix is for them to have their own home. Um, and so I think a huge important thing that I think more missions could invest in is being more housing centric, right? Um, Instead of just having a shelter that welcomes people in for the night, kind of turning some of their investment toward permanent housing, and whether that's leveraging the resources that they have or their stance in the community to help convince landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers, right? These are all things that I think they could do to help with the housing piece. Um, and I tend to agree with you in terms of there are different models for different folks, right? Permanent supportive housing is this idea that we give folks a permanent place to live and we surround them with supportive services. Sometimes that looks like building one big building. And this is actually what I do for my day job. I'm the housing director at a nonprofit. We have two buildings. Each of them have about 45 units that everyone who lives in those units is an 18 to 24-year-old who's coming out of homelessness. What's amazing about those buildings is I can put case managers in the lobby, I can put a therapist in the lobby, I can put a
Yeah.
substance use counselor in the lobby, and all 45 of those residents have access to that 40 hours a week to those services that they need to help them navigate their life and to take steps forward, make a goal plan, and hopefully eventually move out for a good reason. Um,
Yeah.
the downside to that is you've just put 45 of the most vulnerable people in one building and asked them to share space, to um, have to deal with one another's issues and trauma, right? And some people have a lot of barriers, a lot of mental health issues, substance use issues, and some people don't. And they feel very frustrated that they have to live in the same place as the other, and that other person
Mhm.
feels frustrated because they're judged by this person when they're just trying to get better, right? And then on top of that, those buildings often only get built in the poor parts of town. So there's sort of this like segregation thing that happens. So we need that model, and we also need a scattered site model, which says we can actually house you at an affordable apartment anywhere in the city. We can bring services to you, which is less efficient than having services in the lobby, but it is better for folks who are kind of on the trajectory to regain employment, to have more
Mhm.
community integration. When we house people who have experienced homelessness in the same building as folks who have never experienced homelessness, there's shared life experiences, there's growth, there's community that happens. When we put people all in the same building, we can resource them better, but there's less community integration. So you gain something and you lose something with each version. And I think ultimately it comes down to what each person needs at that point in time. I think there are definitely people who need a 3 to 4 year stay in a building where there's services in the lobby, and then maybe they're ready to go to a scattered site model, and then maybe eventually they're off of subsidized housing altogether and they don't need any services anymore. There's other people that because of their disability, they're going to need services for the rest of their life. They're going to need subsidized rent for the rest of their life, and that's okay too. But the problem is that all of these are each extremely underfunded. So instead of it being options that we give to people based on their individual needs, it ends up being this is what's available, take it or leave it, whether or not it matches what you need. And that's the unfortunate part of this. We need more of all of it, not just more of some of it.
That's good. Well,
Sorry,
yes.
you got me talking shop.
So I know I saw this a long time ago and I don't know where it was, but it was a homeless tiny home community. Have you heard of any of those?
Yes.
And how do you think they work?
Yeah, so I talk about this in the book,
Mhm.
and you said something similar, Brandon, earlier that it's not always what you do, it's how you do it, right? Um, I think tiny home communities, first, the question is, are they meant to be shelter or are they meant to be permanent housing? Because I've seen a lot of like micro shelters put up that are essentially sheds meant to move homeless people out of sight, out of mind. They put a huge fence around it. They put an armed security guard there, like it's basically an internment camp for people experiencing homelessness. That's not good. That's not okay. I have also seen, and I talk about in the book, of amazing models of churches who have like 1 acre of land and they're able to build like 6 to 10 tiny homes on it that have plumbing, that are dignified. Like, yes, they're small, but they're really well designed to have space. And they put a beautiful community garden in the middle, and they have case management. And it's in the middle of the city so that they have access to grocery stores. They're not like out in the middle of nowhere. And I think that's very beautiful. And there's a lot of versions in between, right? So typically, when I hear about a new tiny home, tiny whatever idea, the first things I'm asking are, is it meant to be permanent or is it temporary? Do they have bathrooms? Do they have electricity? And where is it located? Those are usually the 3 or 4 questions that I ask that help give me a sense of, is this a thing that's actually designed to most efficiently and most thoughtfully serve human beings, or is this the most cost efficient way to hide homelessness and make it sound good?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we really appreciate your time tonight.
Course.
And like I said, everybody pick up on the books. They're most places, very easy to get. But we would like to ask you if you could to close us in prayer tonight, please.
Oh, sure.
All right. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah.
So, is there any thing in the program where there's someone to help the people who are able to work to find something they can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Day,
sorry, I missed the last part.
few hours a day. Some of them are able to work, some of them are not, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
is there someone there to help them find a place or no place, even a few hours a day to work?
Yeah. Well, I think you're asking a couple of really interesting things there. One is, um, there the amount of people who are homeless or who have unstable housing who have jobs is a lot higher than we think it is, right? Because often when we think about homelessness, we think of that guy who's always on the street corner, right? But homelessness looks a lot of different ways. And there's a really great recent book called, oh, what's it called? It's by Brian Goldstone. Um, it's called There is no Place for Us. And it's about working homeless. Um, and really, really fantastic book. Because the fact of the matter is that right now, most cities in America, you can't work a full-time job at minimum wage and afford a one-bedroom apartment, um, based on wages and cost of living and the cost of a one-bedroom apartment. So that's kind of the first thing I would say. Secondly, I think anyone who is experiencing homelessness, any case management is going to, if somebody says like, I want to work, I want to get a job, that's that's something the case manager would help them with, right? I train my case managers when they make a goal plan to allow the individual to decide what their goals are and then to help come alongside them in achieving those goals. And for a lot of people, that is, I do want to work, but it is really hard to get a job if there's other things you don't have in place, like your stable housing, right? So
Well,
getting
thank you.
secure housing is a really important thing uh, before you try to secure employment. Because what address are you going to put on a job application? Where are you going to plug in the alarm clock? Where are you going to take a shower to make sure you show up looking the way you need to, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think you're bringing up a really important point, and that separating work from employment and kind of what gives people meaning, right? There are a lot of shelters and housing complexes that for folks who can't work and don't go to work offer just something for people to do, whether it's can you water the plants or can you um, help decorate? Can you help us when we're having a community event to set up tables, right? That isn't about saying like you have to work in order to be worthy of help, but allows people something to do with their bodies to participate in the community, right? And I think we often confuse those, right? And we say, oh, if you're going to be sleeping here, you need to be working because you're earning your spot here, right? And it's not that, but there is dignity in work. There is there is something spiritual, again, to come back to the beginning of saying like people people are expecting me to come because I'm the one setting up the chairs, or if I don't water the plants, they might die, and that would be sad, right? That gives people a sense of this is why I get up in the morning. People are counting on me. My existence has a purpose. And I think we need to spend a lot of internal time separating the dignity of work from employment and separating it from only people who have a job deserve to sleep inside, right? I think that's where those things have become very muddied in our culture. And it makes it hard for us to even have conversations about the dignity of work, if that makes sense.
All right. Well, thank you again. And if you could close us in prayer, we'd love that.
Sure. Thank you, God, for this evening, this opportunity. Thank you for technology that allows me to sit in Minneapolis and talk to these folks in Tennessee. Um, Thank you for their willingness to engage and to ask good and hard questions about what it means to be faithful amidst so much pain and so much hardship. Um, God, I believe that you're up to something. There's new work that you're inviting us into on behalf of those who experience homelessness. May this conversation be a first step, be part of that journey toward solidarity and community with our neighbors who sleep outside. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.